A hardened prison inmate slammed Mason against a cold concrete wall. "You don't belong here," the man growled. But in here, nobody cares. Around them, dozens of inmates stopped to watch. Mason crashed onto the concrete, wiping the blood from his lip as he struggled back to his feet. The inmate charged again. Before the guards could break up the fight, a commanding voice echoed across the prison yard. "That's enough." Every inmate froze. The prison warden stepped forward, accompanied by a woman clutching a thick case file. Her eyes never left Mason. "I've been investigating your case," she said calmly, "and I can prove you never should have been here." For the first time since the steel gates closed behind him, hope had finally found Mason Calloway. The days inside Blackwood State Prison blended into one endless nightmare. Morning arrived long before sunrise. A deafening siren ripped through the prison blocks. Steel doors slammed open one after another. Correctional officers barked orders through the concrete corridors. "Move!" The prisoners poured from their cells. Breakfast wasn't a meal. It was survival. One careless glance. One accidental shoulder bump. One wrong word. That was all it took for violence to erupt. Mason quickly learned that hunger wasn't the most dangerous thing inside Blackwood. People were. The dining hall echoed with shouted insults. Metal trays crashed against tables. Fists settled arguments faster than words ever could. Every inmate watched everyone else. Trust didn't exist. In Blackwood, fear had a scent, and it smelled like blood. After breakfast came the showers. Long rows of rusted pipes poured freezing water onto cracked concrete floors. No one entered alone unless they had no choice. The showers were where the strongest reminded everyone else who ruled the prison. Mason kept his eyes forward. He never spoke unless spoken to. Even then, trouble always found him. Some inmates attacked him simply because he refused to bow his head. Others wanted to build their reputation by breaking the new prisoner everyone believed would eventually surrender. Every bruise on Mason's body told a different story. A swollen jaw from one fight, a split eyebrow from another. Deep purple bruises stretched across his ribs. His knuckles remained swollen from defending himself. Every movement sent sharp pain through his body. Sometimes, even breathing hurt. But every morning, he forced himself back onto his feet. Every beating made him stronger. Every scar became another reminder that he was still alive. The prison yard became its own battlefield. Concrete replaced grass. Watchtowers replaced trees. Razor wire surrounded every inch of freedom. Groups of inmates claimed different corners of the yard like rival kingdoms. No one crossed those invisible boundaries without consequences. One afternoon, the same tattooed inmate who had welcomed Mason to Blackwood stepped directly into his path. A cruel smile spread across his face. "You still standing?" Mason met his eyes without hesitation. "I'm still breathing." The smile vanished. Without another word, the inmate threw a vicious punch. Mason ducked just in time. The fist sliced through the air. Before anyone could react, the fight exploded across the prison yard. Prisoners rushed toward the commotion. A circle quickly formed around the two men. Some inmates cheered. Others pounded their fists against the metal fences. Everyone wanted blood. Punch after punch echoed across the yard. Mason stumbled backward. The tattooed inmate drove another punch into his ribs. Pain shot through his body. But Mason refused to stay down. He answered with a hard right hook that sent the larger inmate reeling backward. The crowd erupted. Correctional officers finally stormed into the circle. "Break it up." Batons were raised. Orders echoed across the yard. By the time the fight ended, both men stood bruised and bleeding. Blood trickled from Mason's split lip. His right eye had already begun to swell. The tattooed inmate spat blood onto the prosso. Concrete. For several long seconds, the two men stared at each other. Then, to everyone's surprise, the inmate gave Mason a slow, respectful nod. For the first time, respect had replaced contempt. Not everyone felt the same. Some prisoners began respecting Mason because he refused to stay down. Others hated him even more. His resilience made him dangerous. Blackwood had tried to break him. It hadn't succeeded. Each night, Mason returned to his tiny prison cell. He lowered himself onto the thin mattress, every muscle screaming in pain. Above him, the cracked concrete ceiling never changed. Silence became his greatest enemy. He closed his eyes. Sleep never came. Instead, he counted every bruise, every scar, every broken dream. Then, morning arrived, and the battle began all over again. The days inside Blackwood State Prison blended into one endless nightmare. Morning arrived long before sunrise. A deafening siren ripped through the prison blocks. Steel doors slammed open one after another. Correctional officers barked orders through the concrete corridors. Move. The prisoners poured from their cells. Breakfast wasn't a meal. It was survival. One careless glance. One accidental shoulder bump. One wrong word. That was all it took for violence to erupt. Mason quickly learned that hunger wasn't the most dangerous thing inside Blackwood. People were. The dining hall echoed with shouted insults. Metal trays crashed against tables. Fists settled arguments faster than words ever could. Every inmate watched everyone else. Trust didn't exist. In Blackwood, fear had a scent, and it smelled like blood. After breakfast came the showers. Long rows of rusted pipes poured freezing water onto cracked concrete floors. No one entered alone unless they had no choice. The showers were where the strongest reminded everyone else who ruled the prison. Mason kept his eyes forward. He never spoke unless spoken to. Even then, trouble always found him. Some inmates attacked him simply because he refused to bow his head. Others wanted to build their reputation by breaking the new prisoner everyone believed would eventually surrender. Every bruise on Mason's body told a different story. A swollen jaw from one fight. A split eyebrow from another. Deep purple bruises stretched across his ribs. His knuckles remained swollen from defending himself. Every movement sent sharp pain through his body. Sometimes, even breathing hurt. But every morning, he forced himself back onto his feet. Every beating made him stronger. Every scar became another reminder that he was still alive. The prison yard became its own battlefield. Concrete replaced grass. Watchtowers replaced trees. Razor wire surrounded every inch of freedom. Groups of inmates claimed different corners of the yard like rival kingdoms. No one crossed those invisible boundaries without consequences. One afternoon, the same tattooed inmate who had welcomed Mason to Blackwood stepped directly into his path. A cruel smile spread across his face. "You still standing?" Mason met his eyes without hesitation. "I'm still breathing." The smile vanished. Without another word, the inmate threw a vicious punch. Mason ducked just in time. The fist sliced through the air. Before anyone could react, the fight exploded across the prison yard. Prisoners rushed toward the commotion. A circle quickly formed around the two men. Some inmates cheered. Others pounded their fists against the metal fences. Everyone wanted blood. Punch after punch echoed across the yard. Mason stumbled backward. The tattooed inmate drove another punch into his ribs. Pain shot through his body, but Mason refused to stay down. He answered with a hard right hook that sent the larger inmate reeling backward. The crowd erupted. Correctional officers finally stormed into the circle. "Break it up." Batons were raised. Orders echoed across the yard. By the time the fight ended, both men stood bruised and bleeding. Blood trickled from Mason's split lip. His right eye had already begun to swell. The tattooed inmate spat blood onto the concrete. For several long seconds, the two men stared at each other. Then, to everyone's surprise, the inmate gave Mason a slow, respectful nod. For the first time, respect had replaced contempt. Not everyone felt the same. Some prisoners began respecting Mason because he refused to stay down. Others hated him even more. His resilience made him dangerous. Blackwood had tried to break him. It hadn't succeeded. Each night, Mason returned to his tiny prison cell. He lowered himself onto the thin mattress, every muscle screaming in pain. Above him, the cracked concrete ceiling never changed. Silence became his greatest enemy. He closed his eyes. Sleep never came. Instead, he counted every bruise, every scar, every broken dream. Then morning arrived, and the battle began all over again. The nights were the worst. When the prison finally fell silent, when the shouting stopped, when the steel doors locked for the last time, Blackwood became a different kind of prison. One built inside the mind. Mason lay motionless on the thin mattress inside his cramped concrete cell. The ceiling above him was cracked. The fluorescent light outside his cell flickered endlessly. Sleep refused to come. Every time he closed his eyes, the memories returned, clearer, sharper, more painful. His mind drifted back to a jewelry store only a few weeks earlier. He remembered standing in front of a glass display case. The jeweler carefully placed a diamond ring into a black velvet box. "You've chosen a beautiful ring," the elderly jeweler had said with a smile. "When are you proposing?" Mason smiled. "Tomorrow." His heart had been full of hope. He had imagined Serena's smile. He had imagined slipping the ring onto her finger. He had imagined spending the rest of his life with the woman he believed loved him. The memory lingered for only a moment, before it shattered. No, he saw another image. Victor Langford's private office. The door slowly opening. Serena sitting on the edge of Victor's desk, their lips locked together. Victor's hand around her waist. The engagement ring slipping from Mason's trembling fingers. The sound of the box hitting the floor. His heart breaking into pieces. Mason suddenly opened his eyes. His breathing became heavy. Even now, the betrayal felt as though it had happened only seconds ago. He sat up on the edge of the bed, running both hands across his face, trying to erase the memory. But prison had a cruel way of forcing a man to relive his worst moments. Another memory surfaced. His mother, Grace Calloway, standing in the kitchen, smiling as she poured him a cup of coffee before work. "You work too hard," she laughed softly. "You need to slow down sometimes." Mason smiled through the memory. Then, he remembered seeing her in the courtroom, her tear-filled eyes, her trembling voice. Mason, the memory broke him. A tear rolled slowly down his bruised face. Then another. Soon, he wasn't fighting the tears anymore. For the first time since arriving at Blackwood, Mason cried. Not because of the beatings, not because of the humiliation, not because of the prison. He cried because he missed home. He missed his mother. He missed the life that had been stolen from him. Outside his cell, a correctional officer silently watched for a moment before continuing down the corridor. Inside, Mason lowered his head. His hands trembled. His tears fell onto the cold concrete floor. Minutes passed. Slowly, he wiped his face, took a deep breath, and looked toward the small barred window high above his cell. A single beam of moonlight slipped through the steel bars. It was faint, almost invisible, but it was there. For the first time in days, Mason realized something. They had taken away his freedom. They had taken away his career. They had taken away the woman he loved. But they had not taken away the man he could still become. Quietly, almost as if making a promise to himself, he whispered, "They can lock up my body, but they'll never imprison my spirit." Outside, the prison remained silent. Inside, a broken man had taken the first step toward becoming stronger. 3 weeks. That was how long Mason had survived inside Blackwood State Prison. 3 weeks of violence. 3 weeks of sleepless nights. 3 weeks of bruises that never had time to heal. By now, he had stopped expecting anyone to come. The outside world had forgotten him, or so he believed. Early one gray morning, the heavy steel door of his cell rattled violently. Clang! A correctional officer appeared outside. He glanced down at the clipboard in his hand. 47258. Mason slowly lifted his head. His face was bruised. His eyes were tired. "You have a visitor." For a moment, he simply stared. Surely he had heard wrong. "A visitor?" The officer looked at him without emotion. "You heard me. Move." Confusion washed over Mason. As he stepped into the corridor, his chains clinked softly with every step. His mind raced. Who would travel all the way to Blackwood? His mother? No. She could never bear to see him behind bars. Serena? The thought disappeared almost as quickly as it came. She hadn't visited once. Not after his arrest. Not after the trial. Not after he was sentenced. Noah? Impossibly. Noah didn't even know whether visitors were permitted. Then, who? The correctional officer escorted him through a maze of concrete hallways. Every heavy security door slammed shut behind them. Each metallic bang echoed through the prison. The closer they came to the visitation wing, the faster Mason's heart began to beat. Finally, they stopped outside a thick steel door. The officer unlocked it. The hinges groaned as it slowly opened. "Go in." Mason stepped inside. The visitation room was silent. A thick sheet of reinforced glass divided the room in two. Rows of empty booths stretched into the distance. Then, he saw her. Standing quietly on the opposite side of the glass was Valeria Moreno. She wore a perfectly tailored navy blue business suit. Her long dark hair rested neatly over her shoulders. In one hand, she held a thick legal case file packed with documents. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't crying. She simply stood there, calm, composed, unshaken. But her eyes told a different story. They carried determination. They carried purpose. Most of all, they carried belief. For several long seconds, neither of them moved. Neither of them spoke. They simply looked at one another through the reinforced glass. For the first time since the steel gates of Blackwood had closed behind him, someone had come looking for Mason Calloway. Not inmate 47258. Mason Calloway. And somehow, without saying a single word, Valeria made him feel something prison had almost stolen forever. Hope. The correctional officer locked the visitation booth behind Mason. A heavy metallic clang echoed through the room. For several long seconds, neither of them spoke. A thick sheet of reinforced glass stood between them. A prison telephone rested on each side. Mason slowly reached for the receiver. Valeria did the same. Silence filled the room. Mason searched her face, trying to understand why she had come. Finally, he broke the silence. "You shouldn't be here." Valeria held his gaze. "I know." Her voice was calm, steady, certain, but I couldn't stay away. Mason let out a tired, bitter laugh. "You came to visit a convicted criminal." Valeria shook her head without hesitation. "No." She leaned closer to the glass. "I came to see an innocent man." The words hit Mason like a thunderbolt. For weeks, he had been called a thief, a fraud, a criminal. For weeks, no one had questioned the verdict. No one, except her. His shoulders slowly dropped. His eyes drifted toward the table. "No one believes me." His voice cracked beneath the weight of defeat. "They all think I stole everything." Without saying another word, Valeria opened the leather case she had brought with her. She carefully placed a thick file against the glass. Hundreds of pages, financial reports, audit records, bank transactions, internal emails, digital forensic analysis. Every page represented another piece of the truth. Her hand rested firmly on the file. "I do." Mason slowly lifted his eyes. For the first time since entering Blackwood, someone wasn't looking at him with pity. Someone was looking at him with faith. Valeria opened the file. "I've spent every day since your conviction investigating Langford Global. The numbers don't make sense. The transactions are too perfect. The approvals appeared too quickly. The evidence against you wasn't just fabricated. It was engineered." Mason listened in stunned silence. She turned another page. "The deeper I investigate, the more I believe Victor Langford didn't act alone. There are missing records, missing witnesses, missing money. And someone has worked very hard to erase every trail." She looked directly into Mason's eyes. "But they missed something." Mason leaned forward. "What?" Valeria closed the file. "Hope." She allowed those words to settle between them. "People lie. Records can be altered. But the truth always leaves a trail." A spark returned to Mason's eyes. The defeated expression that had haunted him for weeks began to disappear. Valeria tightened her grip on the case file. Then she made him a promise. "I don't care how powerful Victor Langford is. I don't care how many people protect him. I don't care how long this takes. I will find the truth, and I will prove your innocence." Mason couldn't speak. His eyes filled with tears. Not tears of pain, not tears of defeat. These were tears of hope. The correctional officer stepped toward the booth. "Time's up." Valeria slowly stood. She held Mason's gaze until the very last second. Then she gave him a small, reassuring nod. Without another word, she turned and walked away. Mason watched her disappear down the long prison corridor until she was gone. The correctional officer unlocked the booth. "Let's go." Mason stood. Something inside him had changed. The broken man who had entered the visitation room no longer existed. As he walked back toward his cell, his shoulders were no longer weighed down by despair. His head was held high. His eyes burned with quiet determination. He stopped for just a moment, closed his eyes, and whispered to himself, "I won't let them bury the truth. No matter how long it takes, I'm coming back." Beyond the walls of Blackwood, the hunt for the truth had already begun. The morning after visiting Mason, Valeria Moreno walked into her office with only one thought on her mind. She wasn't going to let an innocent man spend another day behind bars. She closed the blinds, locked the office door, then placed Mason's case file on her desk. Every document, every financial report, every witness statement, every page from the trial. She stared at them for several long moments. Something wasn't right. The evidence had been too perfect, too clean, too complete. It was as if someone had carefully built a story, one document at a time. Valeria reached for her phone. There was only one person she trusted to uncover the truth: Rebecca Sinclair. 48 hours later, the elevator doors opened on the 38th floor of Sinclair Forensic Intelligence. Rebecca Sinclair stepped into the conference room, carrying nothing but a slim leather briefcase. She was one of the country's most respected forensic financial investigators. For nearly 20 years, she had exposed billion-dollar fraud schemes, collapsed corrupt corporations, and testified in some of the nation's biggest financial crime trials. Executives feared her. Criminals avoided her. Because Rebecca Sinclair had never lost a corporate fraud investigation. She placed her briefcase on the table, removed a pair of reading glasses, and looked directly at Valeria. "You said this couldn't wait." "It can't." Valeria slid Mason's entire case file across the table. "I need you to tell me whether the court convicted the wrong man." Rebecca opened the file without saying another word. The room fell silent. Minutes passed. Page after page. Financial statements, audit reports, bank transfers, electronic approvals, internal emails. Rebecca never spoke. She simply read, occasionally making small notes in the margin. Then, she stopped. Her eyes narrowed. She turned back 3 pages, compared 2 authorization logs, then another. She reached for a calculator, entered several figures, looked back at the reports. Something didn't fit. She leaned back in her chair, folded her arms, and slowly removed her glasses. Valeria watched every movement. "What is it?" Rebecca remained silent for another moment. Then she looked directly into Valeria's eyes. This wasn't ordinary fraud. She tapped the audit reports with one finger. Someone wanted this crime to look perfect. She turned another page. "And that's exactly what makes me suspicious." Valeria leaned forward. "What do you mean?" Rebecca slid one of the financial reports across the table. "In every real financial crime, there are mistakes. Someone forgets a transfer. Someone signs the wrong document. Someone leaves behind a trail." She pointed at the evidence. "But not here. Every signature matches. Every timestamp is flawless. Every approval arrives exactly when it's supposed to." She slowly closed the file. "Real criminals make mistakes." She looked Valeria straight in the eyes. "The person who framed Mason didn't." Silence filled the room. For the first time, Valeria realized the investigation ahead was far bigger than proving Mason innocent. Someone had engineered the perfect crime, and somewhere, the mastermind was still watching. Rebecca Sinclair never trusted appearances. She trusted numbers. Because numbers never lied, people did. The following morning, Rebecca entered Langford Global Headquarters through the front entrance, not as an investigator, but as an independent financial compliance consultant. A temporary access badge hung around her neck. A laptop rested beneath her arm. To everyone around her, she was just another corporate auditor, exactly as she wanted. She smiled politely at the receptionist, signed the visitor register, and disappeared into the finance department. Within minutes, she was sitting inside a quiet records room. Stacks of financial statements covered the table before her. Annual reports, quarterly audits, executive expense records, investment portfolios, bank reconciliations, thousands of pages. Most investigators would have been overwhelmed. Rebecca wasn't. She had spent nearly 20 years exposing billion-dollar corporate fraud. She knew where criminals hid the truth, not in obvious places, but in details everyone else ignored. Hour after hour, she compared financial statements against internal ledgers, cross-checked executive approvals, matched payment timestamps, verified digital signatures. The deeper she dug, the stranger everything became. Large sums of money had vanished without triggering a single internal warning. Entire transactions appeared, then disappeared. Audit trails ended abruptly. Approval records had been overwritten. Payment authorizations were encrypted far beyond the company's normal security protocols. Rebecca stopped typing. Something was terribly wrong. She opened another spreadsheet, then another. Her eyes narrowed. Millions of dollars had been transferred through offshore shell companies registered in different countries. The money moved so quickly, it became almost impossible to follow. Every trail ended at another company, then another, then another. Someone had built an invisible financial maze. Rebecca leaned back in her chair. She had investigated hundreds of fraud cases. She had never seen anything this sophisticated. She quietly whispered to herself, "This wasn't created overnight." She opened one final report, compared it with records from 5 years earlier. Her heartbeat quickened. The same hidden accounts, the same coded transactions, the same missing funds. They stretched back year after year. This wasn't a recent crime. It had been happening for years. Someone inside Langford Global had been stealing billions, long before Mason Calloway ever joined the company. Rebecca slowly closed her laptop. A chilling realization settled over her. Mason hadn't been framed to hide one crime. He had been framed to protect an empire built on corruption. And whoever was behind it would do anything to keep the truth buried. Rebecca knew she was getting close. Corporate conspiracies always followed the same pattern. The deeper you dug, the more frightened people became. Late that evening, her encrypted phone vibrated. Unknown number. She answered cautiously. Silence. Then, a nervous male voice whispered, "Are you Rebecca Sinclair?" She didn't answer immediately. "Who is this?" Another pause. "I used to work in the information technology department at Langford Global. My name doesn't matter. If they find out I called you, I'm dead." Rebecca's expression hardened. "Slow down. What do you have?" The man's breathing was uneven. "The evidence you're looking at. It's incomplete." Rebecca sat upright. "What do you mean?" "They deleted everything. But they missed one thing." Her heartbeat quickened. "What?" "There was a backup server." Rebecca froze. "A backup server?" "Yes. It isn't listed in the company's infrastructure. It doesn't appear on any network diagram. It isn't connected to Langford Global's public system. It was built years ago. Only a handful of executives even knew it existed." Rebecca reached for her notebook. "What was it used for?" The man lowered his voice even further. "Automatic backups. Every financial transaction. Every deleted email. Every audit revision. Every overwritten approval. Nothing was ever truly erased." Rebecca's eyes widened. "If that server still exists..." The man interrupted. "It does. And I know where it is." Silence filled the call. Rebecca realized what she was hearing. If the hidden server contained untouched backup records, it could destroy the entire case against Mason. It could expose everyone involved. She stood from her chair. "I need to meet you." The man hesitated, then quietly replied, "Tomorrow, 9 o'clock. I'll send the location. But come alone." Before Rebecca could respond, the call ended. She immediately looked out through the office window. Something felt wrong. Far below, a black SUV sat parked across the street. Its engine was running. Its headlights remained off. A man inside the vehicle slowly lowered a pair of binoculars. Rebecca's instincts screamed. She wasn't imagining it. Someone was watching her, miles away. The former IT employee hurried through a deserted parking garage. His hands trembled as he clutched a small encrypted flash drive. He glanced over his shoulder. Nothing. He kept walking. Then, footsteps echoed behind him. Slow, steady, growing closer. He turned. No one. His breathing became heavier. He quickened his pace. The footsteps quickened too. For the first time, he realized he wasn't alone. Somewhere in the darkness, someone had already discovered he was talking, and the hunt had begun. The following night, Rebecca and Valeria met inside a secure private office. The curtains remained closed. Every mobile phone had been switched off. The encrypted flash drive lay silently on the conference table. Neither woman spoke. Rebecca inserted the drive into an isolated forensic computer that had no internet connection. The monitor flickered. Lines of encrypted code raced across the screen. One security layer, then another, then another. Minutes passed. Finally, the first hidden files appeared. Rebecca's fingers froze above the keyboard. "They're here." Valeria stepped closer. Thousands of archived financial records filled the screen. Deleted audit reports, hidden approval logs, encrypted payment records, private executive communications, files that should never have existed. Rebecca began opening them one by one. Every new document revealed another secret. Every hidden file uncovered another lie. The room grew quieter with every passing minute. Then, Rebecca opened a folder marked Executive Authorizations. Her expression changed instantly. "What is it?" Valeria asked. Rebecca turned the monitor toward her. There, Victor Langford's digital authorization appeared on the screen. One transaction, then another, then another. Millions of dollars, transferred through companies that existed only on paper. Victor had approved them all. Valeria's heart sank. So it was him. Rebecca slowly shook her head. No. She clicked another file. A second executive signature appeared. Then a third. Then a fourth. Vice presidents, board members, outside financial consultants, international auditors. The list continued. Rebecca stared at the screen in disbelief. This isn't one corrupt executive. She opened another folder. Wire transfers stretched across multiple countries. Shell companies in different jurisdictions. Offshore bank accounts hidden behind layers of anonymous corporations. Every transaction had been carefully disguised. Every trail intentionally buried. Someone had spent years building a financial empire that existed entirely in the shadows. Valeria struggled to process what she was seeing. This is impossible. Rebecca looked at her. No. It's organized. She slowly leaned back in her chair. This wasn't created by one man. It took years. It took influence. It took unlimited resources. And it took people in positions of power. Silence settled over the room. The truth was finally becoming clear. Victor Langford had played a role, but he wasn't the mastermind. He wasn't even the biggest threat. He was only one piece of something far more dangerous. Rebecca closed the final file, then looked directly at Valeria. Mason Calloway wasn't framed by one man. She paused. He was framed by an entire criminal network. The room fell silent. Outside, rain began striking the office windows. Inside, two women had just uncovered a conspiracy powerful enough to destroy governments, Fortunas, and anyone who dared expose it. The city never slept. Neither did the men who ruled it. High above the skyline, on the top floor of De La Vega International Tower, a man stood alone before a floor-to-ceiling window overlooking the city. Alejandro de la Vega, one of the most powerful businessmen in the world, a billionaire whose name opened doors, ended careers, and terrified corrupt executives. He rarely accepted meetings. He rarely spoke to the media, and he never involved himself in cases that didn't matter, which was why, when Valeria Moreno's request reached his office, everyone expected it to be rejected. Instead, Alejandro asked for one thing: Mason Calloway's complete case file. Minutes later, a thick stack of documents was placed on the polished walnut desk before him. Financial records, court transcripts, audit reports, witness statements, digital evidence. Alejandro said nothing. He simply began reading. The room fell silent. Minutes became hours. His executive assistants waited outside without interruption. No phone calls, no meetings. Nothing was allowed to disturb him. One document after another. He examined every signature, every transfer, every approval, every accusation. Occasionally, he made a small note with a fountain pen. Nothing escaped his attention. Finally, he closed the file, folded his hands, and stared out across the city. His expression never changed. Then, he quietly spoke. This man didn't steal. A long silence followed. His next words were even colder. Someone stole his life. The room fell completely silent, because everyone present understood what those words meant. Alejandro de la Vega had made his decision. For the first time, the people behind Mason's downfall had gained an enemy far more dangerous than they could imagine. Alejandro de la Vega closed Mason's case file. The silence inside the executive office became almost overwhelming. His senior advisors exchanged uneasy glances. No one dared interrupt him. Finally, Alejandro pressed a single button on his desk. His chief of staff entered immediately. "Sir?" Alejandro slid the case file across the polished desk. "I need the best." The chief of staff nodded. "I'll contact the top law firms." Alejandro slowly shook his head. "No, I didn't ask for the most expensive lawyer. I asked for the best." He looked directly at his chief of staff. "Bring me Julian Mercer." The room fell silent. Every executive understood the weight of that name. Julian Mercer, the country's most feared trial attorney. A legal strategist whose courtroom victories had dismantled billion-dollar corporations, sent powerful executives to prison, and exposed government corruption. He accepted only a handful of cases each year, and he had never represented a client he believed was guilty. Less than an hour later, the doors of the executive boardroom opened. A tall man in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit walked inside. Julian Mercer. Calm, composed, unreadable. His reputation entered the room before he did. Alejandro stood to greet him. Without a word, he handed Julian Mason's case file. Julian opened it. He didn't rush. He examined every page, every signature, every financial record, every witness statement, every forensic report. Minutes passed. The room remained completely silent. Then, Julian closed the file. He looked directly at Alejandro. "You've already reached your conclusion." Alejandro nodded once. "I have." Julian folded his arms. "And you believe he's innocent?" "I do." Julian walked toward the floor-to-ceiling window overlooking the city. He stood there quietly for several moments. Then he spoke. "If everything in this file is fabricated," he turned slowly, Then, someone spent years preparing the perfect crime. Alejandro nodded again. They underestimated one thing. Julian raised an eyebrow. What? Alejandro's voice became cold. They never expected someone powerful enough to question their story. A faint smile appeared on Julian's face, the kind of smile seen just before a courtroom battle begins. He placed the case file back onto the desk. I'll take the case. Alejandro extended his hand. Julian shook it firmly. At that very moment, a legal war was declared. Not against Victor Langford alone, but against everyone hiding behind the conspiracy that had stolen Mason Calloway's life. Somewhere across the city, the first cracks in the empire of corruption had already begun to appear. Victor Langford had spent years believing he was untouchable. Money protected him. Power protected him. Fear protected him. No one had ever dared challenge him. Until now. Late that evening, the doors of Victor's executive office burst open. His chief of staff entered, his face drained of color. Sir. Victor didn't look up from the document he was signing. What is it? The man swallowed hard. Alejandro de la Vega has taken Mason Calloway's case. Victor's pen stopped moving. For the first time, silence filled the room. Slowly, Victor lifted his head. What did you say? The chief of staff hesitated. It gets worse. Julian Mercer has joined the legal team. Victor's expression hardened. The color slowly drained from his face. He rose from his chair and walked toward the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. His breathing remained steady, but his hands tightened into fists. He knew exactly who Alejandro de la Vega was, and he knew exactly what Julian Mercer was capable of. This wasn't another lawsuit. This was war. Victor turned sharply. Call everyone. Now. Less than 30 minutes later, the executive boardroom was sealed. Only Victor's inner circle remained inside. Senior executives, corporate attorneys, financial directors, outside consultants. Every face around the table carried the same expression. Fear. Victor stood at the head of the room. He didn't raise his voice. That made him even more dangerous. They're coming. No one spoke. They know enough to become a problem. He looked around the table. So, from this moment forward, we erase everything. The room remained silent. Victor pointed toward the head of information technology. Wipe every backup server. Delete every hidden archive. Destroy every unauthorized access log. He turned toward the chief financial officer. Move every offshore account. Close every shell company. Burn every paper trail. Then he faced the corporate legal advisor. I want every potential witness reminded exactly what happens to people who betray this company. The message was unmistakable. Cooperate or be destroyed. No one questioned him. No one objected. Every person in that room understood what was at stake. If one piece of evidence survived, everything would collapse. Victor slowly walked back toward the window. The city lights reflected across the glass. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about Mason Calloway. Mason was never the real threat. Alejandro de la Vega was. Victor stared into the darkness beyond the skyline, then quietly whispered to himself, So, you finally entered the game. A slow smile crossed his face. If Alejandro wants a war, I'll give him one. Outside, the lights of Langford Global continued to shine. Inside, the destruction of the truth had already begun. 48 hours later, the investigation took a dangerous turn. Rebecca Sinclair sat inside her forensic laboratory, comparing recovered backup files against the original corporate records. Something was wrong. Very wrong. Entire folders had vanished. Recovered only hours earlier were suddenly inaccessible. Encrypted archives had been remotely erased. Server logs had disappeared. Someone was cleaning up. Fast. Rebecca immediately grabbed her phone. Valeria. They've started destroying the evidence. Across the city, Valeria froze. She knew exactly what that meant. Victor Langford wasn't waiting for the investigation to reach him. He was striking first. An emergency meeting was arranged that same evening inside De La Vega International Tower. Alejandro de la Vega sat quietly at the head of the conference table. Julian Mercer stood before a massive digital display. Around them, a team of elite forensic accountants, cybersecurity specialists, corporate investigators, and senior trial attorneys prepared for battle. Julian pointed toward the screen. They're deleting records. They're moving money. They're intimidating potential witnesses. They know we're closing in. The room fell silent. Everyone turned toward Alejandro. He had listened without interruption, without emotion, Without panic, finally, he stood. He walked slowly toward the floor-to-ceiling window overlooking the city. Then he spoke. They're running because they know we're getting closer. No one questioned him. No one doubted him. The hunt had entered its final stage. Alejandro turned back toward the team. From this moment forward, we move faster than they do. We protect every witness. We recover every file. And we expose every person behind this conspiracy. Julian nodded. The courtroom battle begins now. Across the city, inside Langford Global Headquarters, Victor Langford watched in silence as confidential files disappeared into an industrial shredder. Boxes of financial records were carried into a secure incineration room. Hard drives were crushed beneath hydraulic machines. Backup storage devices were smashed beyond recognition. Years of evidence reduced to dust. Victor folded his arms. His expression remained cold. But behind his eyes, fear had finally appeared. He watched another stack of confidential documents vanish forever. Then he quietly spoke. If Mason Calloway walks free, we're all finished. No one answered. No one needed to. Outside, the first light of dawn began to rise over the city. A war for the truth had begun, and only one side would survive. The conspiracy was beginning to collapse, and the people behind it knew it. Inside Langford Global, panic spread through the executive offices. Phones rang without stopping. Emergency meetings replaced scheduled appointments. Executives who had once walked the hallways with confidence now avoided eye contact. They all understood one thing. If the truth surfaced, everything would fall apart. Victor Langford stood at the head of the boardroom. His voice was calm. His eyes were not. They're getting too close. The room remained silent. No one dared respond. Victor slowly looked around the table. Find every witness, every employee, every consultant, every accountant. I don't care what it costs. I don't care what it takes. I want them silent. Within hours, people began disappearing. A senior accountant failed to report for work. A financial controller suddenly resigned without explanation. An executive assistant emptied her office and vanished overnight. Phones went unanswered. Apartments stood empty. Email accounts were permanently deleted. It was as if every person connected to the fraud had simply disappeared. Rebecca Sinclair watched the reports arrive one after another. She knew exactly what it meant. They're cleaning house. Valeria looked at her in disbelief. They're erasing witnesses. Rebecca nodded. And we're running out of time. That evening, Rebecca left her office carrying a secure evidence case. The streets were unusually quiet. Rain drizzled across the empty sidewalks. Halfway to her car, she noticed the same black SUV parked across the street. Its engine was running. Its windows were completely black. Rebecca kept walking. She unlocked her car. Just as she reached for the door handle, a dark sedan accelerated toward her. Its engine roared. Its headlights flashed. The vehicle charged straight at her. Rebecca reacted instantly. She threw herself sideways. The sedan missed her by inches. Its tires screamed across the wet pavement before disappearing into the night. Her briefcase slammed onto the ground. Documents scattered across the rain-soaked street. Rebecca struggled to catch her breath. This wasn't intimidation anymore. Someone had just tried to kill her. Minutes later, police sirens echoed through the city. Detective Logan Pierce stepped out of an unmarked police vehicle. A veteran homicide detective known for exposing high-level corruption, he studied the skid marks, collected the scattered documents, then looked at Rebecca. You weren't hit, 'cause they missed. His expression hardened. They wanted you dead. Rebecca slowly nodded. Logan looked toward the dark street where the sedan had disappeared, then quietly spoke. This isn't just corporate fraud anymore. He turned back toward Rebecca. Someone isn't just hiding the truth. They're hunting everyone who knows it. Silence settled over the crime scene. For Detective Logan Pierce, the investigation had just become personal. The following morning, Detective Logan Pierce led Rebecca and Valeria into a secure digital forensics laboratory operated by the Financial Crimes Division. Armed officers guarded every entrance. No one was allowed inside without authorization. If Victor's network discovered what was about to happen, years of hidden corruption could disappear forever. In the center of the laboratory sat the hidden backup server recovered from the abandoned storage facility. Dust covered its metal casing. Its blinking power light was barely visible. For years, it had silently recorded everything Langford Global thought it had erased. A senior cyber forensic analyst carefully connected the server to an isolated recovery system. No internet, no outside access, no chance of remote deletion. Rebecca folded her arms. Begin. The room fell silent. Lines of encrypted code flooded the monitors. Security barriers unlocked one after another. The analyst worked without speaking. Minutes felt like hours. Finally, the lead analyst stopped typing. I've got something. Everyone rushed toward the screen. Folders began appearing one after another. Deleted audit reports, archived financial statements, executive approval logs, encrypted emails, hidden payment records, thousands of files, thought to be lost forever. Rebecca's heartbeat quickened. They're all here. The forensic team continued restoring the damaged data. Every recovered file uncovered another lie. Every restored document exposed another crime. Then, a notification flashed across the largest monitor. Executive authorization confirmed. Rebecca frozen. Logan stepped closer. The analyst opened the file. Victor Langford's digital signature appeared on the screen. Not once, not twice, dozens of times. Every fraudulent transfer, every hidden account, every unauthorized payment had been personally approved. Valeria covered her mouth in disbelief. He signed everything. The analyst nodded. And there's more. Another folder opened. Original financial ledgers appeared beside the altered versions presented during Mason's trial. The differences were undeniable. Amounts had been changed. Dates had been rewritten. Approvals had been fabricated. Entire transactions had been inserted after the fact. Logan stared at the evidence. They didn't just frame Mason. They rewrote history. Quote, Rebecca slowly looked toward Valeria. Her voice was steady. Her eyes never left the screen. Mason Calloway never stole a single dollar. Silence filled the laboratory. Months of lies. Months of manipulation. Months of suffering. Collapsed in a single moment. Logan turned toward the forensic team. Secure every file. Make 3 encrypted copies. Send one directly to the court. No one touches this evidence without my authorization. The lead analyst nodded. It's done. Rebecca slowly closed the recovered case file. A quiet smile appeared on her face for the first time since the investigation began. She looked at Logan, then at Valeria. Finally, she spoke the words they had fought so hard to hear. We don't have a theory anymore. She paused. We have proof. The courthouse was surrounded long before sunrise. News vans lined the streets. Reporters crowded the entrance. Cameras waited for the man the world had branded a criminal. At exactly 9 o'clock, the courtroom doors opened. Mason Calloway entered in prison restraints, escorted by correctional officers. Every eye followed him. Across the courtroom, Victor Langford sat beside his legal team. His tailored suit projected confidence, but the tightening grip on his pen betrayed the fear growing inside him. At the front of the courtroom, Julian Mercer calmly arranged his files. He looked less like a lawyer, and more like a man who already knew the verdict. The judge entered. All rise. The courtroom stood. After everyone was seated, Julian rose to his feet. Your Honor, today's hearing is not about correcting a legal mistake. It's about exposing a criminal conspiracy that stole an innocent man's freedom. The courtroom fell silent. Defense calls Rebecca Sinclair. Rebecca walked confidently to the witness stand and took the oath. Julian approached. Miss Sinclair, what did your investigation reveal? Rebecca faced the court without hesitation. My forensic investigation confirmed that every critical financial record used to convict Mason Calloway was deliberately manipulated. She explained the altered transactions, the fabricated approvals, the hidden offshore accounts, the deleted audit trails. Every statement was supported by recovered forensic evidence. Victor's attorney immediately stood. Objection, speculation. Julian never turned toward him. Your Honor, every statement is supported by authenticated digital evidence recovered from the company's hidden backup server. The judge looked toward the defense. Objection overruled. Rebecca stepped down. Julian spoke again. The defense calls Detective Logan Pierce. Logan walked toward the witness stand carrying a sealed evidence case. He carefully opened it. Inside was the recovered backup server. The courtroom lights dimmed as the digital evidence appeared across the large courtroom monitors. Original financial records, recovered approval logs, deleted executive emails, hidden payment authorizations. Logan pointed toward the screen. These are the original company records. He opened another file beside them. And these are the falsified records presented during Mason Calloway's original trial. A wave of whispers swept across the courtroom. The differences were undeniable. Amounts had been changed. Dates had been rewritten. Digital approvals had been forged. Entire transactions had been inserted after the fact. Julian slowly walked toward the monitor. "Detective, who authorized these fraudulent transactions?" Logan opened the final encrypted file. Victor Langford's digital authorization filled every screen in the courtroom. One approval, then another, then another. Dozens of fraudulent transactions carried his electronic signature. The whispers stopped. Victor's confidence vanished. Sweat formed across his forehead. His breathing became uneven. For the first time since the investigation began, Victor Langford looked defeated. Julian faced the judge one final time. "Your Honor, Mason Calloway was never the criminal. He was the victim." The judge carefully reviewed the evidence. Minutes passed. No one moved. No one spoke. Finally, the judge reached for the gavel. "This court finds that Mason Calloway's conviction was obtained through fabricated evidence, falsified financial records, and deliberate criminal conspiracy." He struck the bench. "The conviction is hereby overturned." The sound echoed through the courtroom. The judge looked directly at Mason. "Mason Calloway." A brief silence followed. "This court declares you innocent." The courtroom erupted. Some applauded. Others stood in stunned silence. Mason closed his eyes. For the first time in months, he breathed as a free man. The courtroom had barely settled when the rear doors burst open. Federal agents wearing dark jackets moved swiftly through the crowd. Their badges flashed beneath the courtroom lights. Every conversation stopped. Every camera turned toward the entrance. Victor Langford looked over his shoulder. For the first time in years, genuine fear appeared in his eyes. The lead agent stepped forward. "Victor Langford, you are under arrest for conspiracy, financial fraud, obstruction of justice, evidence tampering, and multiple related federal offenses." The courtroom fell silent. Victor forced a smile. "This is a mistake." The lead agent didn't flinch. "No, Mr. Langford. The mistake was believing you'd never be caught." The handcuffs snapped shut around Victor's wrists. At the same moment, federal agents moved across the courtroom, arresting senior executives, financial consultants, and members of Victor's inner circle. One after another, they were escorted out in handcuffs. The empire they had spent years building collapsed in a matter of minutes. Victor looked toward Mason. Hatred filled his eyes. Mason simply looked back. He didn't smile. He didn't celebrate. Justice didn't need revenge. It only needed the truth. Hours later, the gates of Blackwood State Prison opened one final time. This time, they opened for Mason Calloway, not as inmate 47258, but as a free man. He stepped beyond the gates and stopped. The warm afternoon breeze touched his face. For months, he had dreamed of this moment. Now it was real. He closed his eyes, filled his lungs with fresh air, and slowly smiled. Waiting just beyond the prison gates stood the woman who had never stopped believing in him, his mother, Grace Calloway. The moment their eyes met, neither of them could hold back the tears. She ran toward her son, wrapped both arms around him, and held him as though she would never let go again. "I'm so proud of you," she whispered. Mason embraced her tightly. "I made it home, Mom," standing a short distance away. Valeria Moreno watched quietly. A gentle smile crossed her face. She hadn't fought for recognition. She had fought for justice. Seeing Mason free was all the reward she needed. As Mason looked toward the open sky, he realized something. They had stolen his career. They had stolen his reputation. They had stolen precious months of his life. But they had failed to steal the one thing that mattered most: the truth. The camera slowly pulled away. A free man stood beneath an endless sky. Behind him, the prison gates closed forever. Ahead of him, a new life was waiting. They stole his freedom. A quiet pause followed. But they could never steal the truth. Freedom was only the beginning. Winning back his life would be Mason Calloway's greatest challenge. The headlines that had once called him a criminal now called him an innocent man. Television networks apologized. Newspapers corrected their stories. Langford Global stock collapsed. Across the country, people who had doubted Mason finally learned the truth. But Mason wasn't interested in revenge. He wanted something far more valuable: a second chance. A week after his release, a black luxury sedan arrived outside his mother's house. The driver opened the rear door. Waiting inside was Alejandro de la Vega. Mason climbed in, Neither man spoke as the car crossed the city. Finally, Alejandro broke the silence. "You've spent months proving who you weren't." He looked at Mason. "Now it's time to become who you were always meant to be." The car stopped in front of De La Vega International Tower. Mason stared up at the glass skyscraper that disappeared into the clouds. Alejandro smiled. "This is where your future begins." Over the following months, Alejandro became more than a business partner. He became a mentor. He taught Mason how to rebuild trust, how to lead people, how to recognize loyalty, how to make difficult decisions without losing his integrity. Every lesson carried the wisdom of a man who had built an empire without sacrificing his principles. Mason absorbed every word. Every setback made him stronger. Every success restored another piece of the confidence that had been stolen from him. One morning, Mason received an unexpected visitor. Noah. His oldest friend stood outside the office with a nervous smile. "I heard De La Vega International was hiring." Mason laughed for the first time in what felt like forever. "I know the perfect position." Moments later, Noah officially joined the company. The two friends who had survived betrayal and hardship together now stood side by side, ready to build something greater than either had ever imagined. Not everyone celebrated. Across the street from De La Vega International, Serena sat alone inside a quiet cafe. Through the window, she watched Mason and Noah walk into the building, smiling as they discussed their future. She lowered her eyes. Memories flooded her mind. The engagement ring, the promises, the life she had thrown away. For the first time, she understood that wealth had never been what made Mason extraordinary. It had been his heart, and she had traded it for ambition. Mason never looked back. Some chapters were never meant to be reopened. Months later, the elevator doors opened on the top executive floor. Mason stepped out wearing a tailored Navy suit. Employees greeted him with respect. He walked past glass offices and stopped before a large wooden door. His name was engraved in polished silver. Mason Calloway, Executive Vice President. He rested his hand on the handle for a brief moment before slowly opening the door. Sunlight poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows. The city stretched endlessly beneath him. This office wasn't a reward. It was proof. Proof that truth could outlive lies. Proof that character could outlast betrayal. Proof that a broken life could be rebuilt. Mason walked to the window and looked across the skyline. A quiet smile appeared on his face. For the first time in a very long time, he wasn't looking back. He was looking forward. The seasons changed. Weeks became months. De La Vega International entered its most successful year in company history. Under Alejandro's guidance, Mason transformed into the leader everyone believed he could become. But while the business flourished, something even more meaningful was quietly taking shape. Valeria Moreno was there through every challenge, every late-night strategy meeting, every difficult negotiation. Every victory they earned together strengthened the bond between them. It wasn't built on promises. It wasn't built on attraction. It was built on trust. The one thing Mason had once believed he would never find again. One evening, after another successful board meeting, Mason and Valeria stood alone on the rooftop terrace overlooking the city. The skyline shimmered beneath thousands of lights. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. Some silences carried more meaning than words ever could. Valeria finally smiled. "You've changed." Mason looked toward the horizon. "I had to." She nodded. "No." She looked into his eyes. "You healed." For a brief moment, neither of them looked away. Across the city, another chapter was coming to an end. Inside a packed federal courtroom, Victor Langford stood before the judge wearing a prison uniform instead of an expensive suit. The empire he had built through lies had completely collapsed. His co-conspirators had turned against him. The evidence was overwhelming. The judge delivered the final sentence. "Victor Langford, this court sentences you to 30 years in federal prison." The gavel struck. Victor slowly lowered his head. For the first time, power couldn't save him. Money couldn't protect him. The truth had finally won. Days later, Serena requested one final meeting with Mason. He agreed. They met inside a quiet park where everything had once seemed possible. Serena struggled to find the words. "I destroyed the best thing that ever happened to me." Tears filled her eyes. "I'm sorry, Mason." He looked at her with kindness. "Not anger, not bitterness, just peace. I forgave you a long time ago." Serena closed her eyes. "I wish I could change everything." Mason gave a gentle smile. "So did I." He paused. But life isn't about going backward. It's about choosing what comes next. Serena nodded slowly. She finally understood. Some mistakes couldn't be undone, only accepted. As she quietly walked away, Mason never looked back. His future was no longer behind him. It was waiting ahead. That evening, Mason asked Valeria to meet him at the same place where his heart had once been broken. The city lights reflected across the river. A gentle breeze moved through the evening air. Valeria smiled as she approached. "You sounded nervous." Mason laughed softly. "I am." He reached into his jacket pocket. Slowly, he removed a small black velvet box. The very same ring that had once fallen onto the floor of Victor Langford's office. The ring that had once become a symbol of betrayal. Mason opened the box. The diamonds sparkled beneath the city lights. He looked into Valeria's eyes, then quietly asked, "Valeria Moreno, will you marry me?" 6 months later, the bells of St. Andrew's Cathedral echoed across the city. Friends, family, colleagues, business leaders, everyone gathered to witness a love story no one thought would ever exist. At the end of the aisle stood Mason Calloway, wearing a perfectly tailored black tuxedo. Beside him stood Noah, smiling proudly as his best man. Near the front row, Alejandro de la Vega watched in silence. Pride filled his eyes. He hadn't just saved a man, he had watched him rebuild himself. The cathedral doors slowly opened. Valeria Moreno stepped inside. She was breathtaking. Every guest rose to their feet. Mason couldn't take his eyes off her. This time, there was no betrayal, no heartbreak, no fear, only love. Moments later, they exchanged their vows. They exchanged rings. And before God, their families, and everyone who had stood beside them through the darkest chapter of their lives, they became husband and wife. Applause filled the cathedral. Alejandro smiled. Noah wiped away a tear. Even Grace Calloway couldn't hold back her emotions. My son finally found his happiness. The years that followed became everything Mason once believed he had lost forever. Together, Mason and Valeria transformed De La Vega International into one of the most respected billion-dollar companies in the world. Their leadership was built on honesty, integrity, compassion. Employees followed them not because they feared them, but because they believed in them. Alejandro eventually stepped aside, confident the future was in capable hands. He had found more than a successor. He had found a legacy. Years later, laughter filled the Calloway family home. Children ran through the garden. Grace sat on the porch, smiling as she watched her grandchildren play. Inside the study, Mason opened a small wooden box. His young son looked up with curiosity. "Dad, what's that?" Mason gently lifted an old black velvet ring box. He opened it. The same diamond ring sparkled in the afternoon sunlight. His son smiled. "Is that Mom's ring?" Mason nodded. "Yes." His son looked at him. "Why do you keep it in this box?" Mason smiled quietly. "Because this ring reminds me that life can change in a single moment." He looked at the ring. "There was a time when I thought it represented the worst day of my life." He paused. "I believed everything was over." His son listened carefully. "But I was wrong." Mason looked toward the garden where Valeria laughed with their children. "This ring taught me that heartbreak isn't always the end of the story. Sometimes, it's the beginning of a better one." He closed the ring box gently. Outside, the evening sun settled over the city. The family laughed together. The pain of the past had become the strength of the future. The camera slowly pulled away from the home. The skyline stretched into the distance. A life once destroyed had become more beautiful than Mason had ever imagined. Life broke him. The truth rebuilt him. Love completed him. And the ring that once witnessed his greatest heartbreak became the symbol of his greatest blessing. Muchas gracias por acompañarnos hasta el final. Si esta historia tocó tu corazón, no olvides darle me gusta, suscribirte y compartir este video. Nos vemos en la próxima historia. Que Dios te bendiga. Thank you very much for staying with us until the end. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video. See you in the next story.